The wrench hit the concrete so hard it cracked, and the most decorated engine specialist in all of Europe wiped his hands, turned to the billionaire standing behind him, and said the 4 words that would haunt her for months. "It can't be fixed." Serena Marchetti stared at her dead father's Ferrari silent cold, condemned by 17 of the finest engineers alive. She was ready to bury it. Then one phone call dragged her to a rusted garage outside Detroit, to a broke single father the whole world had thrown away. He pressed his ear to that dead engine, shut his eyes, and whispered the one thing nobody else dared to say. "This car isn't dead. You people just stopped listening." Before we begin, tell me in the comments what city you're watching from tonight, so I can see just how far this story travels. And if you still believe that one forgotten man can shake the entire world, take a second right now, hit that subscribe button, and stay with me all the way to the very end. The alarm clock in Wade Coleman's bedroom had been broken for 3 years, and he'd never once been late. He didn't need it. His body knew. Every morning at 4:50, 10 minutes before the sun even thought about coming up over the flat, gray sprawl outside Detroit, his eyes opened on their own. He lay still for exactly 1 minute, listening to the old house settle and pop, and then he got up because a man who lies in bed after his eyes are open is a man giving up, and Wade Coleman had promised himself a long time ago that whatever else the world took from him, it would never take that. "Dad." The voice came from the doorway. Small, careful. Grace was 9, and she had a way of standing there in her socks with her arms crossed like a little foreman who'd caught the crew slacking. "You're supposed to be asleep," Wade said, buttoning his shirt. "You're supposed to make pancakes on Saturday." "It's Thursday, kiddo." "It's Saturday." Wade stopped. He counted backward in his head, and the girl was right, and something about being wrong in front of his own daughter, about what day it was, made his chest go tight. He worked so many hours, the days had stopped having names. They were just gray, 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 one after another. And he shoveled them into the furnace of the mortgage and the school fees and the electric bill and hoped the fire stayed lit. "You're right," he said. "It's Saturday. Get the flour down. I'll be there in a minute." She grinned and disappeared, socks whispering down the hall, and Wade stood alone for a second and pressed the heel of his hand against his eyes. 6 years. 6 years since he'd been Wade Coleman's senior design engineer, the man they called a genius in glass-walled rooms in front of men in $10,000 suits. 6 years since it had all been ripped out from under him in a single afternoon. Now he was Wade Coleman, the guy who fixed your transmission for $100, less than the dealership, and let you pay half now and half whenever. He didn't complain. He'd stopped complaining years ago. Complaining was just noise, and noise didn't fix anything. They ate the pancakes standing up at the counter, because the kitchen table had a wobble, and Wade hadn't gotten around to shimming the leg. Grace talked the whole time about a girl at school named Bethany, who'd said Grace's shoes were from the wrong store, about a science project on volcanoes, about whether they could maybe someday get a dog. "Dogs eat?" Wade said. "So do I." "You're cheaper." Grace laughed, syrup on her chin, and for one clean second, the tightness in Wade's chest let go completely, and he thought this: whatever else happens, this is the thing. This is the whole thing. Then his phone rang. He almost didn't answer it. It was 6:40 in the morning on a Saturday, and the only people who called at that hour were bill collectors and wrong numbers. But the number on the screen wasn't one he recognized. It had a New York area code, and something about it made the hair on his arms stand up before he could tell himself why. "Coleman," he said. There was a pause on the line, a long one, and then a voice he had not heard in 6 years said very quietly, "Wade, it's Danny." Wade set his fork down. Grace looked up. She was 9, but she wasn't stupid, and she could read her father's face the way he read an engine, by the small things, the things nobody else noticed. She saw his jaw tighten. She saw his eyes go somewhere far away. "Danny Reyes," Wade said. It wasn't a question. It was a name he'd tried to file away and lock in a drawer, and here it was walking around loose again. "Yeah," Danny said. "It's me. Don't hang up, please. Give me one reason. Because I've got a Ferrari that 17 engineers say is dead, and I think you're the only man alive who can bring it back." Wade laughed. It wasn't a nice laugh. "You've got the wrong Coleman, Danny. The genius you're thinking of doesn't exist anymore. He got fed to the wolves 6 years ago while his so-called friends stood around and watched." The silence on the other end of the line was the silence of a man who'd been waiting a long time to hear exactly that. "I deserve that," Danny said. "You deserve worse." "Wade, I've got a daughter to feed and a customer coming in at 8. I don't have time for whatever this is. Just listen. 30 seconds, then you can hang up and I'll never call you again, I swear on my mother's life." Wade looked at Grace. She was watching him with those big, serious eyes. He carried his coffee out to the back porch, slid the door shut so she couldn't hear, and leaned against the rail in the cold. 29 seconds, he said. "Go." Danny went. "You remember Vittori Automotive? The Italian house, the one that folded back in the 70s, but the family kept a private collection. There's a woman named Serena Marchetti. Her father was the last of the Vittori engineers. When he passed, he left her one thing, a Ferrari. He restored himself by hand over 20 years, a 1962. One of 9 ever made. It's not just a car, Wade. It's the last thing her father ever touched. It's her whole heart wrapped in aluminum and steel. Get to the part where it's dead. It won't start. It ran fine for years, then 8 months ago it just died. In her garage, sitting still. No crash, no flood, nothing. One day it turned over, the next day it was gone. She's spent a fortune. She flew in a specialist from Maranello, another from Stuttgart, a team from a lab in Japan. 17 of the best engine men on Earth have had their hands inside that car, and every single one of them said the same thing. Wade already knew. He said it out loud anyway because part of him needed to hear how it sounded coming out of his own mouth. "It can't be fixed." "It can't be fixed," Danny echoed. "The last guy, the specialist from Maranello, he threw his wrench on the ground so hard, it cracked her garage floor, and he told her to her face to stop wasting everybody's time, to let it go, to bury it." "Then bury it," Wade said. "Some things are dead, Danny. That's just the truth. Not everything comes back." "You don't believe that." "I believe it more than you'd think." There was a rustle on the line, like Danny had switched the phone to his other ear, like he was about to say the thing he'd really called to say. "I remember something," Danny said. 10 years ago, that old Charger somebody towed into the shop, the one the whole floor gave up on. You put your ear against the block, and you closed your eyes, and you stood there for 20 minutes while everybody laughed at you. And then you pointed at one bolt out of 1,000, and you said, "There, that's where it's hurting." And you were right. You've always been right, Wade. Everybody else looks at a machine and sees metal. You're the only man I ever met who could hear one. Wade didn't say anything. Out in the yard, a bird started up somewhere in the bare trees. "They stopped listening," Danny said. 17 of the smartest men on Earth, and every one of them walked in already knowing what they were going to find. That's not diagnosis, Wade. That's a funeral. And I don't think that car needs a funeral. I think it needs somebody who'll actually listen to it. That's you. That's only ever been you." Wade's throat was tight. He hated that. He hated that this man who had stood in a conference room 6 years ago and said nothing done, nothing, while they nailed Wade to a wall for a mistake that wasn't his, could still reach into his chest and find the one string that hadn't been cut. "Why do you care?" Wade said. "Really? After all this time? Why does Danny Reyes suddenly care whether some rich woman's car runs?" The line was quiet for a moment. "Because I've spent 6 years knowing what I did to you," Danny said. "And I can't fix that. But I can do this. I can put you in a room where the truth about what you can do stops being a secret. Serena Marchetti has more power in one phone call than you and I will make in our whole lives. If you fix that car, if you do the impossible thing 17 men said couldn't be done, she will owe you. And I think the world owes you, Wade. I think it's owed you for 6 years." Wade looked back through the glass door. Grace had climbed onto the counter and was trying to reach the syrup to put it away up on her tiptoes, tongue between her teeth. Careful, so careful, exactly the way he'd taught her to be careful. "I've got a customer at 8, Wade said. But the fight had gone out of his voice, and they both heard it. "I'll pay you $5,000 just to look," Danny said. "Just to walk around it once and tell her yes or no. Win or lose, you keep the 5. That's a month of school fees, Wade. That's a dog for your kid." Wade shut his eyes. "How do you know about my kid?" he said quietly. "Because I never stopped keeping track of you," Danny said. "Not once. And I'm sorry. For all of it. Let me start making it right." Wade Coleman stood on his cold back porch with the coffee going lukewarm in his hand, and for the first time in 6 years, he let himself remember what it had felt like to be the man in the room everyone turned to when the impossible thing landed on the table. He remembered the hum of it. The click when a problem that had beaten 100 smart people finally opened up under his hands like a lock finding its key. He'd told himself he didn't miss it. He'd told himself that for 6 years. He'd been lying. "When?" he said. Danny let out a breath like a man who'd been holding it for a decade. "She can be there today. She's already in the country. She's got the car on a flatbed, Wade. She's been driving it around the whole Northeast looking for one man who'll say yes. Everybody said no. Everybody. She's about to give up on it forever." "Today," Wade repeated. "Say the word and I'll send her your way right now." Wade looked at his daughter one more time. She'd gotten the syrup up onto the shelf. She turned around on the counter, saw him watching through the glass, and waved at him with both hands beaming like he'd just walked back from the war. "Send her," Wade said, and hung up before he could change his mind. He didn't tell Grace what the call was about. Not right away. He made her promise to spend the morning at Mrs. Petrov's next door, the old woman 2 houses down who watched Grace when the shop got busy and never took a dime for it, just fresh bread and a jar of pickles whenever Wade could spare them. Grace didn't want to go. She could tell something was happening, something big. Kids always can. "Is it a good thing or a bad thing?" she asked him at the door. Wade crouched down to her level. He put both hands on her shoulders. "I don't know yet," he said, because he never lied to her, not even the small kind. "But I'll tell you the second I do. Deal. Deal." She stuck out her hand and they shook on it serious as 2 men closing a contract, and then she threw her arms around his neck and squeezed and ran off down the sidewalk to Mrs. Petrov's, and Wade watched her the whole way until the old woman's door opened and swallowed her up safe. Then he went out to the garage to wait. The garage was the one thing he had left. One bay poured concrete, a roll-up door that stuck when it rained, a workbench his own father had built in 1978. The tools hung in perfect order on the pegboard, each one clean, each one in its place, because a man's tools were the last thing that stayed loyal to him. Wade wiped down the bench that didn't need wiping and organized a drawer that was already organized, and he told himself he wasn't nervous. He was lying about that too. The flatbed came at 10:30. He heard it before he saw it, the low diesel grind of a truck too big for his little residential street air brakes, hissing gears dropping. He walked out onto the cracked driveway and stood there with his arms crossed and watched it back up, and there, chained down on the bed under a fitted cover, the color of storm clouds, was a shape he would have known anywhere. Long hood, low haunches, the unmistakable curve of a machine built in an age when men made cars the way they made cathedrals by hand on their knees for the glory of it. A black Mercedes pulled up behind the truck. The driver got out and opened the rear door. Serena Marchetti stepped out into the gray Michigan light, and even Wade, who had spent 6 years scrubbing every trace of that other world out of his life, understood in 1 second that he was looking at power. She wore no jewelry. She didn't need any. She wore a charcoal coat that had cost more than Wade's truck, and she carried herself like a woman who had walked into 100 rooms full of men who thought they knew better and had walked out of every one of them proven right. She looked at the garage. She looked at the sticking roll-up door and the concrete with the oil stains and the hand-painted sign that just said Coleman Auto. And Wade watched her make a decision about him before she'd said a single word. And he watched the decision be disappointment. "You're the mechanic," she said. It wasn't a question. It was the same tone the man from Maranello must have used when he threw his wrench. "I'm Wade Coleman." Danny Reyes told me you were an engineer. I was. What happened? Wade held her gaze. 6 years ago, that question would have gutted him. Now it just sat there between them, an old wound with a scar over it. Long story, he said. You didn't drive a Ferrari on a flatbed across 4 states to hear it. You want me to look at your car or not? Something flickered behind her eyes. She wasn't used to being talked to like that, but she also wasn't used to men who didn't flinch, and Wade could see her recalibrating, moving him from one column to another in that ledger she kept behind her eyes. 17 engineers have looked at it, she said. So I heard. The best in the world. Men with laboratories. Men with computers that cost more than your entire street. Every one of them told me the same thing. Her voice caught just slightly on the last word, and she hated that it caught. Wade could see her hate it. They told me to let it go. And you drove it here anyway. Danny Reyes swore to me that you hear things other people can't. She said it flatly, like she was quoting something absurd back to its source. He said you could put your ear against a dead engine and tell it where it hurts. I told him that was a children's story. He told me to come anyway. And here you are. And here I am. Her jaw was tight. Because I have nothing left to lose except the last thing my father ever built with his own 2 hands. So yes, Mr. Coleman, I drove it here anyway. Prove Danny Reyes right or prove him wrong, but do it quickly. I don't have the patience I used to. Wade nodded slowly. Bring it in, he said. It took 20 minutes to get the car off the flatbed and roll it into his single bay. And when they pulled the cover off, Wade Coleman forgot for one long moment that he was a broke single father in a stained work shirt. Because under that cover was one of the most beautiful things he had ever seen in his life. The paint was a deep, impossible red, hand-rubbed to a depth that seemed to have no bottom, like looking into wine. Every curve flowed into the next like water. This was not a car that had been manufactured. This was a car that had been loved into existence 1 hour at a time over 20 years by a man who was gone now and had left it behind as a message his daughter was still trying to read. He restored it himself, Serena said quietly. She had come to stand beside him. Her voice had changed. The steel was still there, but underneath it now was something raw. Every part. He used to say a machine remembers the hands that built it. He used to say if you build something with love, some of the love stays inside it forever. She let out a small, broken breath. And then it died. In the garage. 8 months ago. And I thought maybe that meant he was really gone. Finally gone. As long as it ran, some part of him was still... She stopped herself. Straightened. Put the steel back on like a coat. Just look at the car, Mr. Coleman. Wade didn't say anything. He walked around it once. Slow. His hands behind his back, not touching, just looking the way you'd approach an animal you didn't know yet. He crouched at the front. He crouched at the rear. He got down on the concrete and looked at the underside without a light, just letting his eyes learn the shape of it. Tell me what the 17 men did, he said. Serena crossed her arms. They ran every diagnostic that exists, compression tests, electronic scans. They pulled the fuel system apart. 2 of them pulled the entire engine out and put it on a stand and took it down to individual components and found nothing wrong. Nothing. Every part tests perfect. The fuel is good. The spark is good. The compression is good. The timing is good. On paper, that engine should run. It should turn the key and roar. Her voice hardened. It doesn't. It turns over and catches nothing. Like a heart with no reason left to beat. The man from Maranello. The last one, he said, there are machines that simply lose the will to run, and there is no science that can explain it, and no man alive who can fix it, and that I should stop torturing myself and put it in a museum behind glass and let it be a beautiful dead thing. And that's when he threw his wrench. That's when he threw his wrench. Her mouth was a thin line. 17 of the greatest engineers on earth, Mr. Coleman. And you are a man who fixes minivans in his garage. So tell me, what are you going to do that they didn't? Wade got to his feet. He wiped his hands on the rag from his back pocket. Not because they were dirty, but because it was a thing his hands did when his mind was already 3 moves ahead. "They looked," Wade said. "All 17 of them. Every one of them looked at that engine like it was a crime scene. They came in with their computers and their tests and their theories, and they were all looking for something big. A cracked block, a seized rod, a dramatic failure worthy of a car like this. They wanted the death to be as impressive as the machine." He shook his head slowly. "But that's the mistake. That's the whole mistake right there." "What mistake?" "They looked," Wade said. Nobody listened. Serena stared at him. "I'm going to need you to be quiet now," Wade said. "Completely quiet. And I'm going to need you to send your driver outside and turn off your phone, and I need every fan and every compressor in this building shut down. I need it so silent in here you can hear your own blood move." "For what?" "So I can hear the car," Wade said like it was the most obvious thing in the world. For a moment, he was sure she would laugh at him the way the whole shop floor had laughed at him 10 years ago over that old Charger. He watched her face do the calculation. The billionaire CEO, the 17 experts, the museum, the wrench on the floor, the beautiful dead thing, and then he watched her look at the car, at her father's car, at the last warm thing in a cold world, and he watched her decide that a children's story was the only thing she had left. Everybody out. She said not to Wade, but to the driver, to the truck man, to the world. Now. They went. The garage emptied. The compressor ticked and shut down. The furnace clicked off. And then it was just Wade Coleman and Serena Marchetti and a dead Ferrari, in a silence so complete it seemed to press against the ears. Wade opened the hood. He didn't reach for a single tool. He didn't touch a wire. He pulled his old rolling stool over next to the engine bay, and he sat down on it, and he leaned in, and he laid his bare hand flat against the cold metal of the engine block the way a doctor lays a hand on a chest. "Turn it over," he said quietly. "Don't try to start it. Just turn it over, then stop." Serena climbed into the driver's seat. She turned the key. The starter cranked. The engine spun and spun, chuffing, catching nothing, that horrible sound of a machine trying and failing to come to life, and Wade sat perfectly still, with his hand on the block, and his eyes closed, and his head tilted like a man listening for a voice underwater. "Again," he said. She turned it again. Crank, crank, crank. Nothing. Again. Crank, crank. Nothing. An hour passed like that. Wade moved his hand a few inches at a time, across the engine, resting it here, resting it there. His eyes always closed, his face gone somewhere, the way it went. Serena watched him from the driver's seat, and at first she watched with the flat-tired contempt of a woman who had already spent a fortune on smarter men than this one. But somewhere in that hour, the contempt drained out of her because she had never in her life seen anyone touch a machine the way this man was touching hers. Not like it was a problem to be solved. Like it was a person he was trying to comfort. Like it was hurt and afraid, and he was telling it without any words that somebody was finally here. "Once more," Wade murmured. "Slow." She turned the key one last time. The engine spun. And this time, Wade Coleman was not listening to the engine at all. He had stopped listening for the loud thing an hour ago. He'd let the loud sounds go, the crank, the fuel pump, the whir of the starter, all the big obvious noises the 17 men had chased around and around. He let all of it fall away, and underneath it, faint, buried, almost nothing at all, he heard it. A tick, not a knock, not a bang, not a grind. Just the tiniest, softest, most patient little tick, so small, no microphone would ever have caught it under all that noise. So small, no man who came in looking for a catastrophe would ever have stooped low enough to notice. A tick, once per revolution. Like a heart with one valve just barely closing wrong. Like a whisper from something that had been trying to tell the truth for 8 months while 17 brilliant men shouted questions at it. Wade's eyes opened. His breath went out slow. He knew that sound. He had heard that exact sound one time before in his life on a test bench 6 years ago in a lab that no longer let him through its doors. He had heard it because he was the one who had designed the part that made it. He had heard it and understood it before the whole world decided he was a fraud and threw him out into the cold. Serena had stopped cranking. She was watching his face through the windshield. She had spent a lifetime reading rooms, reading boards, reading the exact half-second a man decided whether to lie to her. And she read Wade Coleman now, and what she saw on his face made her open the car door and stand up on legs that weren't quite steady. "What?" she said. "What is it? What did you hear?" Wade Coleman sat back on his stool. He looked at the beautiful dead machine, and then he looked at the woman who'd driven it across 4 states chasing a children's story because it was the last thing on earth she loved. 17 men came looking for the reason your father's car died," Wade said, and his voice was very quiet and very steady and very sure. "And they never found it because there isn't one. Nothing broke, Ms. Marchetti. Nothing failed. This engine tests perfect because it is perfect. Every part in it is doing exactly what it's supposed to do." "That's impossible. It won't run." "It won't run," Wade agreed, "because of one thing so small, nobody thought to get low enough to hear it. One tiny piece buried where no diagnostic ever points doing something it was never supposed to do quietly, patiently once every single time that engine turns. They didn't miss it because they weren't smart enough. They missed it because they were looking for a scream." He put his hand flat against the block one more time, gentle, almost tender. "And this car has only ever been whispering." Serena Marchetti stood in the middle of a stained garage outside Detroit. A billionaire who had buried her hope somewhere between Maranello and Michigan. And she felt something move in her chest that she had not let herself feel in 8 months. "You're telling me," she said slowly, "that the car isn't dead." Wade Coleman looked up at her. And for the first time since the phone had rung that morning, for the first time in 6 long years, the man they'd thrown away, the forgotten genius, the nobody in the stained work shirt, looked exactly like the man he used to be. "The car isn't dead," Wade said. "It never was. Everyone just stopped listening." The words hung in the air of the garage for a long moment, and Serena Marchetti did something Wade Coleman had not expected. She sat down. Not in the driver's seat of the Ferrari, but on the cold concrete floor of his single-bay garage in her charcoal coat that cost more than his truck right there on the oil-stained ground, and she put her face in her hands and she did not make a sound. Wade didn't move to comfort her. He'd learned a long time ago that some grief needs room more than it needs arms. He just sat on his stool with his hand still resting on the engine block, and he waited, and he let a woman who owned half of everything cry on his garage floor like she owned nothing at all. When she finally looked up, her eyes were red, but her voice was steady again. 8 months, she said. 8 months I believed he was gone twice. Once when he died, and once when the car did. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, an ordinary gesture, a human one, and Wade watched the billionaire disappear for a second, and a daughter take her place. "And you're telling me it was never gone at all?" "I'm telling you what I heard," Wade said carefully. "I could be wrong. I've been wrong before. The 17 men were sure, and they were wrong." "The 17 men were sure," Wade agreed. "That was their problem. Certainty makes you deaf." He stood up off the stool and pulled the rag from his pocket again, working it through his fingers. "I'm not sure of anything. I've got a guess. A good guess. But before I promise you that car runs again, I have to be certain. And to be certain, I have to take something apart that no man alive is supposed to be able to reach without ruining it." Serena got to her feet, brushing the grime off her coat without seeming to notice or care that it was there. "Then take it apart." "It's not that simple." "Everything is that simple when you have money, Mr. Coleman. Whatever the part costs, I'll—" "It's not about the part," Wade said, and the flatness in his voice stopped her. "The part costs about $40. That's not the problem." He looked at her steadily. "The problem is where I heard that sound before." Something in the way he said it made her go still. "Where?" Wade set the rag down on the workbench. He looked at the Ferrari for a moment, that impossible red, that machine somebody's father had loved into existence. And then he looked back at Serena Marchetti, and he made a decision he'd sworn for 6 years he would never make. He decided to tell the truth to somebody who could actually do something with it, 6 years ago, I worked for a company called Halverson Dynamics, he said. You've heard of them. Everybody's heard of them. They make components for half the performance engines in the world. High-end cooling systems, thermal management, the stuff that lets an engine run hot and hard without eating itself alive. He crossed his arms. I was their lead design engineer, and I designed something. A cooling regulator, a little valve smaller than your fist that solved a problem the whole industry had been beating its head against for 30 years. It let an engine run at the exact edge of its thermal limit and never cross it. Not once. It could feel heat coming a half second before it arrived and open itself just enough just in time every time. He paused. I called it the Coleman valve, because I'm not a humble man apparently. I built it. I tested it. I stood in a lab and I listened to it work, and it made a sound. A tiny sound. Once per cycle. A little tick. Serena's eyes moved slowly from Wade's face to the open engine bay of her father's Ferrari, and Wade watched her arrive at it before he had to say it. There's one in there, she said. There's one in there, Wade said. Your father was one of the best engineers the automotive world ever produced. Danny told me he restored this car over 20 years, every part by hand. And somewhere along the way, 6 or 7 years ago, your father got his hands on a Coleman valve. My valve, an early one, a prototype before Halverson ever put it into production. I don't know how. Men like your father knew everybody. He put it into this engine because it was the best thing anyone had ever made for keeping a classic engine alive under load. And it worked. For years, it worked perfectly. He walked around to the front of the car and rested his hand on the fender light, respectful. And then, 8 months ago, one tiny part inside that valve, a part I designed, a part I could machine again in an afternoon, wore past its tolerance. Not enough to break. Not enough to fail any test, just enough to hold the valve open a hair too long once per cycle. Just enough to bleed away the pressure the engine needs to catch. Just enough to make a perfect engine unable to start for a reason no diagnostic on Earth would ever find, because the diagnostics don't even know that valve exists. Why not? Wade's jaw tightened. Because Halverson buried the prototype, and then they buried me. The silence in the garage changed shape. Serena Marchetti had built an empire, reading the moment a story turned, and she felt this one turn under her feet. Tell me the rest, she said quietly. You didn't drive here for my life story. I drove here for the truth about my father's car, and you just told me the truth about my father's car runs straight through your life. So tell me the rest, Mr. Coleman. All of it. Wade looked at her for a long moment. And then, because he was tired, bone-tired, in a way that had nothing to do with sleep, the tired of a man who'd carried something alone for 6 years, he told her. I built the valve. Halverson loved it. It was going to be worth hundreds of millions. And about 6 months before it went to production, there was a problem on a completely different project. A big fleet contract, a batch of cooling units that failed thermal testing and cost the company a fortune, and nearly killed a test driver when one of them let go on the track. Somebody had to take the fall. The board wanted a name and a face and a story they could tell the client and the insurance company and the press. He laughed, short and bitter. And there I was. Young. Arrogant. No allies on the board. The guy with his name on all the important work, which meant the guy with the biggest target on his back. They pulled records. They found emails I'd never sent sitting in my outbox signing off on the failed units. Approvals I never gave with my signature on them. Test results I never saw flagged as reviewed by me. Forged. Every one of them. But you try proving a negative to a room full of men who've already decided. You try walking into a boardroom and saying, I didn't write the email that's sitting in my own account. They fired me. They made sure the story got out. Wade Coleman, the reckless engineer who cut corners and nearly killed a man to hit a deadline. No firm within 1,000 miles would touch me after that. My wife? He stopped. Started again flatter. Grace's mother left about a year into it. She said she couldn't be married to a man the whole world hated. I don't blame her. It was a lot to be married to. And the valve, your valve. Wade's mouth twisted into something that wasn't a smile. Here's the part that still keeps me up. 18 months after they threw me out, after they made sure my name was mud, after they took everything, Halverson Dynamics filed a patent. A revolutionary new cooling regulator. Feels heat coming and opens itself just in time every time. Set to change the whole industry. He looked at her. They called it the Halverson Thermal Governor. My valve, my design, down to the geometry of the internal seat. The only thing they changed was the name and the man who got the credit. There's an executive there, Preston Vance. He was a junior director back when I got fired. He's near the top now, and his name's on that patent. On my patent. He's made a fortune off it. He's built a whole career on the thing that got me thrown into the street. Serena Marchetti was very quiet. So you understand now, Wade said, why this isn't simple. That valve in your father's engine, it's an early one. A prototype. The real one. The original. The thing that predates Halverson's patent by years. And the tick I heard is the sound of my design working exactly the way I built it to. If I pull that valve out to fix it, and anybody who knows what they're looking at ever sees it, it proves the design existed before the patent. Serena breathed. It proves you built it first. It proves I built it first, Wade said, which is exactly the kind of thing a company like Halverson has whole floors of lawyers to make sure never sees daylight. He shook his head. So no, Ms. Marchetti. It's not as simple as $40 in an afternoon. The second I open that valve, I stop being a mechanic fixing a rich woman's car. I become the man who can prove Halverson Dynamics stole a fortune and framed an innocent man to cover it. And the last time I threatened people like that, they took my career, my name, and my marriage in a single afternoon. He picked the rag back up just to have something in his hands. I've got a 9-year-old asleep 2 houses down. I have to think about what I'm putting on the table before I flip it. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Outside, the flatbed's engine had gone quiet. The driver was somewhere out of earshot as ordered. The furnace kicked back on with a soft thump. What's her name? Serena said. Your daughter. Grace. How old was she when they did this to you? 3. Serena nodded slowly. She walked to the front of the Ferrari and looked down into the engine bay at the beautiful assembly of metal her father had built by hand. And somewhere in there, hidden the little valve that connected a dead man's masterpiece to a living man's ruin. My father built this car for 20 years, she said, not looking up. Do you know what he used to say to me when I was a girl? He'd have his head under a hood just like this, greased to the elbow, and he'd say, Serena, the world is full of men who take. Takers build nothing. They just wait until someone else builds something beautiful, and then they find a way to put their name on it. She looked up at Wade. He hated takers, Mr. Coleman, more than anything on this earth. He would rather this car stay dead forever than owe its life to a lie. Her voice hardened into that steel Wade had seen when she first stepped out of the Mercedes, but now the steel was pointed somewhere else. You're asking me whether it's worth the risk to open that valve. Let me ask you something instead. If you fix that car and the truth about your design comes with it, you have a shot. A real one. To take back your name. To prove what they did. Isn't that worth something? It's worth everything, Wade said quietly. That's exactly why it scares me. When you've got nothing left, they can't take anything from you. The second I've got a shot at getting my life back, I've got something to lose all over again. You've got your daughter either way. Yeah, Wade said. And I'd rather her have a father who's poor and safe than a father who's poor and buried under a lawsuit he can't afford to fight. He set the rag down for the last time. You want to know the honest truth, Ms. Marchetti, I can fix your car. I'm nearly certain of it. I can machine that part and have this engine roaring by the end of the week and never breathe a word about where the valve came from or what it proves. Fix the car. Take my $5,000. Send you and your father's masterpiece back to wherever billionaires keep beautiful things. Nobody ever has to know the rest. That's the safe way. That's the smart way. And an hour ago, that's exactly what I planned to do. And now? Wade looked at the car for a long time. And now I keep thinking about a man I never met. He said, greased to his elbows, telling his little girl he hated takers. And I keep thinking there's a valve in his engine with my name on it, and another man's name on the patent, and I've spent 6 years telling myself I was at peace with that, and it turns out I've just been lying so quietly I couldn't hear it. Like your car." Serena Marchetti almost smiled. It was the first time. "Then stop lying quietly," she said. "Open the valve." Wade held her gaze. "You understand what you're signing up for. If we do this, if I pull that part, and it proves what I think it proves, and we take it to the people who need to see it, you don't get to just be a customer who got her car fixed. Halverson has money, and lawyers, and a chairman named Whitfield who does not lose. They will come for me, and if you're standing next to me, they will come for you too. Your board, your reputation, your company. You're a public person. You've got a lot more to lose than a poor mechanic from Detroit." "I have a lot more to fight with too," Serena said, "which is exactly why I'm still standing here." She pulled off her coat, folded it once, and laid it over the workbench like she was rolling up her sleeves. "My father spent his whole life building beautiful things and watching lesser men get rich off them. He died with more talent in his hands than the entire board of Halverson Dynamics has in their whole bloodline, and he died in a workshop, not a mansion, because he never once played the game the takers play. I have spent 20 years playing that game and winning it, Mr. Coleman. And do you know what I've learned?" She leaned back against the fender of her father's car. "The takers only win because nobody ever makes them afraid. They've never in their lives sat across a table from someone who couldn't be bought and couldn't be scared. I'd like to be the first. On behalf of my father, and on behalf of a 3-year-old who lost her daddy's good name before she was old enough to spell it." Wade Coleman stood in his garage and looked at a woman he had known for 2 hours and felt something he had not felt in 6 years, something he'd forgotten the shape of. It took him a second to name it, and when he did, it startled him. Hope. It was hope. "All right," he said. His voice came out rougher than he meant it to. "All right, but we do it my way. Careful, documented, every step. Because if we're going to open that valve, we're not just fixing a car, we're building a case. And I've learned the hard way that men like Halverson win in the details. So we don't leave them a single detail. Tell me what you need." "A camera. A good one on a tripod running the whole time I've got that engine open, so there's a record no one can claim was faked. A lawyer, not one of yours. They'll say you own me. We need somebody clean, somebody with no connection to either of us, who can say under oath." She watched me pull an original prototype valve out of a 20-year restoration that predates Halverson's patent by years. "And I need you to say nothing to anybody. Not your board, not your assistant, not the man who drove that flatbed. Nobody knows what's in this garage until we're ready for everybody to know at once. Because the moment Halverson hears the name Wade Coleman and the word valve in the same sentence, this stops being a car repair and starts being a war." Serena took out her phone. "The lawyer I can have here tomorrow morning, Rachel Bennett. She's not mine. She's the one lawyer in this country who's beaten me in court, which is exactly why I trust her. The camera I'll have within the hour." She looked up at him. "What do you need for the part itself?" "That's the strange thing," Wade said, and for the first time, a small, real smile touched his mouth. "For the part itself, all I need is what's already on that wall." He nodded toward the pegboard, toward the tools hung in perfect order toward the lathe in the corner that had been his father's. "That's the whole cruel joke of it, Ms. Marchetti. They took my career, my name, my marriage, my future. And the thing I need to undo all of it costs $40 in stock steel and one long night at a lathe I've had the whole time. I could have machined that part in my sleep 6 years ago." He looked at his own hands. "I've been sitting on the answer to my entire life in this garage the whole time. I just never had a reason to go looking for it. Nobody ever brought me the right car." Serena looked at the Ferrari. "My father's car." "Your father's car," Wade said. 17 of the best engineers in the world drove right past the thing that could clear my name because they came looking for a scream. And a dead man I never met left it in my garage anyway." Serena was quiet for a moment. "You believe in that things happening for a reason. I believe I've got a dead engine, a stolen patent, and a 9-year-old who deserves to grow up knowing her father wasn't the man they said he was. Wade said, I don't need it to be fate. I just need it to be true. And it's true. He walked to the pegboard and took down a set of calipers, and his hands, Serena noticed, had stopped hesitating. They moved now like the hands of the man he used to be. Get me the lawyer and the camera. I'll get you the part. And then we'll wake your father's car up, and while we're at it, we'll wake up a few people who thought I was never getting up again. She made the calls right there in the garage, standing next to the Ferrari, and Wade listened to a billionaire quietly rearrange the machinery of the world on his behalf. The lawyer summoned a car, sent the flatbed driver dismissed for the day, with instructions to say nothing to anyone. And while she made them, Wade did something he had not done in 6 years. He pulled the drop cloth off the lathe in the corner. He plugged it in. He listened to it spin up that old familiar whine, and he felt 6 years of rust break loose somewhere inside his own chest. By the time Grace came home at dusk, Mrs. Petrov walking her up the drive, the old woman squinting suspiciously at the black Mercedes still parked out front. Wade had already made the first rough cut of the part in his head 100 times. He knew the geometry. He'd never forgotten it. You don't forget the shape of the thing that broke your life. Dad? Grace stopped dead in the driveway, staring at the shape under the storm gray cover because they'd rolled the Ferrari back out to make room to work, and the low haunches were unmistakable even to a 9-year-old. Dad, is that a... It's a Ferrari, baby. In our garage. In our garage. Grace looked at the Mercedes and at the elegant woman standing next to it, who was watching her with an expression Grace couldn't read, and then back at her father, and Wade saw her doing the same math he'd taught her to do on everything. The careful, watchful math of a kid who'd learned early that good things and bad things both showed up wearing suits. Is it a good thing or a bad thing? Grace asked, exactly as she had that morning. Wade crouched down to her level the way he always did. I told you I'd tell you the second I knew, he said. Remember, we shook on it. We shook on it. So here's what I know. He put both hands on her shoulders. You remember how I always tell you when something's not working? The answer is almost never the loud thing. The answer's almost always the quiet thing. Everybody's too busy to hear. Grace nodded slowly. She'd heard it 100 times standing on a stool beside him at the bench. Today, somebody brought me a car that 17 very smart people said couldn't be fixed, Wade said. And I listened to it. And it was telling the truth the whole time. Everybody was just too busy being smart to hear it. He paused. And listening to it, Gracie listening to it, told me something else too. Something about me. About the thing that happened to me a long time ago before you were big enough to remember. Something I stopped listening to because it hurt too much. Grace's face had gone very serious. Is it the thing you don't talk about? Wade blinked. He'd never said a word about Halverson to her. Not one word. How do you know I don't talk about it? Because you don't talk about it, Grace said simply with the terrible clarity of a child. There's a thing. Everybody can tell there's a thing. You go quiet on the same day every year, in October. She looked at him steadily. I'm not a baby dad. I've known there was a thing for a long time. I just never asked because it makes your face go like it's going right now. Wade Coleman knelt on his cold driveway and looked at his daughter, his careful, watchful, whip-smart 9-year-old who had known for years that her father was carrying something and had loved him enough to never make him name it, and something in him broke open that had been sealed shut for 6 years. Yeah, he said, and his voice wasn't steady at all. It's the thing. And I think today might be the day I finally start fixing it. Not just the car. The thing. He pulled her into a hug, and over her shoulder he saw Serena Marchetti turn away and pretend to study the Mercedes giving them the room, and he was grateful for it. It's going to be a good thing, he said into Grace's hair. But it might get scary first. Some people did something bad to me a long time ago, and I've got a chance to prove it. And people who do bad things don't like getting proven wrong. So there might be some loud days coming, some hard days. But I need you to remember what I always tell you. The answer's the quiet thing, Grace said into his shoulder. Not the loud thing. That's my girl. She pulled back and looked at him, and there were tears standing in her eyes. But she didn't let them fall, because she was her father's daughter, and her father didn't let them fall either. "Are we going to be okay?" she asked. And Wade Coleman, who for 6 years had answered every version of that question with the careful hedging of a man who couldn't afford to promise anything, looked at his daughter and did something reckless. He made a promise. "We're going to be better than okay," he said. "I'm going to get us our name back, Gracie. The real one. The good one. I promise." That night, after Grace was asleep, after Mrs. Petrov had been thanked and sent home with a jar of the last of the pickles, Wade Coleman went back out to the garage. Serena had gone to a hotel in the city with instructions to return at 8 with the lawyer. The camera she'd promised had already arrived by courier, and Wade set it up on its tripod exactly the way he'd asked, framing the engine bay, and he turned it on, and he spoke to it. "My name is Wade Coleman," he said to the lens alone in his garage at midnight. "Formerly lead design engineer at Halverson Dynamics. Today is the 11th. In a few hours, I'm going to open a cooling regulator inside a 1962 Ferrari restored privately by the late Aldo Marchetti. I believe that regulator is an original prototype of my own design predating U.S. patent filed by Halverson Dynamics under the name Halverson Thermal Governor. I'm making this recording so that whatever happens next, there's a record that starts here tonight with the truth." He paused, looking into the lens. 6 years ago, they told the world I was a man who cut corners and nearly got somebody killed. I've spent every one of those 6 years fixing other people's cars in this garage and letting the world believe it. I'm done letting them believe it. He reached out and gently patted the fender of the Ferrari, the way you'd reassure a patient before surgery. "So let's find out if a dead man's car can wake up a living man's life." He switched the overhead light to the bright work lamp, and he pulled on his gloves, and Wade Coleman, the forgotten genius, the nobody in the stained work shirt, the single father. 2 houses down from an old woman's pickles, leaned into the engine bay of the most beautiful machine he had ever touched, and went looking at last for the small quiet thing that 17 brilliant men had been too loud to hear. Somewhere in the city, in a glass tower with his name in the lobby, Preston Vance slept soundly, dreaming of the patent that had made him never once imagining that the man he'd buried 6 years ago was awake at that very moment in a Detroit garage holding a $40 answer in his steady, unhurried hands. And in a hotel room across town, Serena Marchetti sat awake by the window with her father's photograph in her lap and told a dead man quietly that she thought she'd finally found someone who hated the takers as much as he had. He worked until the sky outside the garage window went from black to the color of dishwater, and when he finally pulled the valve free of the engine, he sat down hard on his stool and stared at it in his open palm for a long time before he could make himself believe it was real. It was smaller than his fist, just like he'd told her. A little cylinder of machined steel darkened with years of heat cycles, and along one side where the casting met the bore was a mark. Not a serial number, not a factory stamp. A set of initials scratched into the metal with the point of a scribe by a young man's arrogant hand 6 years ago. W.C. He'd done it to every prototype he ever made. A private signature, a habit his supervisor had told him a dozen times to quit. He'd never quit. And now at 6 in the morning, in a garage outside Detroit, that stupid, arrogant habit was sitting in his palm like a key. "There you are," Wade said softly to the valve, to the boy who'd scratched those letters to the man he'd been before they took everything. "There you are." At 8 o'clock, the black Mercedes came back up the drive, and this time there were 2 people in it. Serena Marchetti got out first, and behind her came a woman Wade knew immediately was Rachel Bennett, because she moved through the world like a person who had never once been intimidated by a room. She was maybe 60, silver hair cut short, a canvas bag over one shoulder that had clearly seen more courtrooms than most lawyers see in a career, and she looked at Wade's garage and his sticking door and his hand-painted sign the way an appraiser looks at an estate cataloging weighing missing nothing. "You're the mechanic," Rachel Bennett said. And it was the 3rd time in 2 days someone had opened with that line, but she said it differently. She said it like a question she already suspected had a complicated answer. "I'm Wade Coleman. Serena tells me you might be about to hand me the most interesting case of my career, or the fastest way to get us both sued into the ground, and she isn't sure which. Rachel set her bag down on the workbench. So, before I let either of you say another word, I want you to understand something. I don't do faith. I don't do feelings. I know it in my gut. I do evidence. If you've got something real, I will fight harder for you than any lawyer in this country. But if this is a story you've told yourself so many times, it feels true. Tell me now, and I'll drink your coffee and drive back to the city, and we'll never speak of it again. She looked at him levelly. So, which is it? Wade Coleman opened his palm and showed her the valve, and turned it so the morning light caught the 2 scratched letters on the side. Rachel Bennett bent close. She took a pair of reading glasses from her breast pocket and put them on, and bent closer, and Wade watched a woman, who did not do feelings, go very still. "Those are my initials," Wade said. "I scratched them into every prototype I ever built. Halverson's own records will show I had a documented habit of doing it. My supervisor wrote me up for it twice. It's in my personnel file, the file they've still got in a drawer somewhere. This valve came out of an engine that Aldo Marchetti restored over 20 years, and the restoration is documented receipts, photographs, and insurance appraisal. If we can establish that this valve was installed in that engine before the date Halverson filed their patent, then their patent is built on a design that provably predates it." Rachel finished, still looking at the valve. "And a prior art claim, that specific and that physical, doesn't just threaten the patent. It reopens the question of why you left the company. Because a man doesn't quietly walk away from the most valuable design of his career and let someone else patent it 18 months later. Not unless something was done to make sure he couldn't fight back." She straightened up and took off her glasses and looked at Wade Coleman with an expression that had somewhere in it the first flicker of the fight he'd been promised. "You were fired for cause. Gross negligence. Falsified approvals. I never falsified anything." "I believe that's what you believe," Rachel said. "That's not the same as evidence. What have you got?" And that was when Wade Coleman walked to the back of his garage to a cabinet he kept locked and took out the old toolbox, a battered red steel toolbox that had been his father's, and set it on the bench and opened it. There were no tools inside. There hadn't been for 6 years. Instead, there were folders, notebooks, a stack of dated engineering journals in his own tight handwriting, a hard drive in an anti-static bag, printed emails, copies of forms. 6 years, Wade said quietly. "Everybody thought I just crawled off to lick my wounds. And mostly I did. But every October, on the day they fired me, I'd sit down at this bench and I'd add to it. Everything I could remember. Everything I could still get my hands on. Every design journal I'd taken home before they locked me out. They never thought to ask for the personal notebooks. They figured a broken man wasn't a threat. Timestamps. Version histories on the hard drive that show the valve design maturing month by month, dated by the file system for 2 full years before Halverson ever filed. My original testing logs. And he pulled out a single folder thinner than the rest, and his hand was not quite steady. The emails, the forged ones, the approvals with my signature that I never gave. I couldn't prove they were forged 6 years ago, but I kept them. And I always thought if I ever got them in front of somebody who knew what to look for the metadata. The metadata, Rachel Bennett said, and now she was not appraising anymore. Now she had crossed some line inside herself. On a forged internal email will show when it was actually created and by whom, regardless of what the visible date says. She looked at the thin folder in his hand like a woman looking at water in a desert. "You have the original files, not printouts, the actual files, on the drive. I made 3 copies. One's in a safe deposit box. One's with a friend in another state. This one never leaves the garage." Rachel Bennett sat down slowly on the edge of Wade's stool, which put her at eye level with the toolbox full of 6 years of a wronged man's patience, and for a moment she didn't say anything at all. Then she looked up at Serena. "You told me he was a mechanic," she said. "He is a mechanic. Serena said. "He's a mechanic, the way a landmine is a paperweight." Rachel stood back up, and something had changed in her entirely. Some professional switch had been thrown, and when she spoke again, it was fast and precise, and Wade understood he was watching a different kind of expert do the thing they were built to do. "All right, here's how this works, and you're both going to do exactly what I say, or I walk. First," she pointed at the camera on its tripod still running. "That's good that stays on, but from now on, I control the record because a defense attorney will tear apart anything that looks staged. And we are going to do this so clean it squeaks. Second, we do not fix that car today. I know you want to, I know she wants to, but the second that valve goes back in the engine, it's no longer independent evidence, sitting in a neutral hand. It's a part in a running car, and the chain of custody gets complicated. So the valve comes out, it gets photographed, measured, and sealed by a neutral third party today, before it goes anywhere near that engine again. Third," she turned to Serena, "you tell no one. Not your board, not your COO, not the man who signs your legal retainers. Because the moment Halverson gets a whiff of this, they will not fight it in a courtroom. They will fight it in the dark the way they fought it the first time. And this time, we are going to be ready for the dark." "How much time do we have?" Serena asked. "Until they find out," Rachel said. "Which in my experience is always sooner than you think. Money has ears everywhere." She was already unpacking her bag, pulling out a laptop, a legal pad, a small digital scale, a set of calipers of her own. "How does anyone know you're here at all? Who knew you were bringing the car to this man?" Serena and Wade looked at each other. "Danny Reyes," Wade said. "My old colleague. He set it up. He's the only one who—" "Then Danny Reyes is the first leak," Rachel said flatly. "Not because he means to be. Because he's a person and people talk. Who does Danny Reyes work for now?" The garage went quiet. "He didn't say," Wade admitted slowly, and something cold began to move through him. "He just said he had a client with a Ferrari that 17 engineers had given up on. He never said who he worked for now. 6 years ago he was at Halverson with me. He was in the room when they fired me, and he never said a word. I always figured he stayed on after I left, but I never—" "Call him," Rachel said. "Right now. Put it on speaker. Don't tell him anything about the valve. Just ask him one question. Ask him who signs his paychecks." Wade took out his phone. His thumb hovered over Danny's number, and a whole different fear opened up under him, a fear that had nothing to do with lawyers or patents. Because if Danny Reyes had led him into this, if the whole thing, the phone call, the guilt, the "let me make it right," was a hook with something on the other end of the line, then Wade Coleman had rolled his daughter's whole future into a garage with the wolves. He pressed the button. He set the phone on the bench. It rang twice. "Wade." Danny's voice came through warm, a little too quick. "How'd it go? Did you look at the car? Did you— Who do you work for now, Danny?" There was a pause. Half a second. But Wade had spent his whole life hearing the small quiet thing under the loud thing, and he heard it in that half second, heard the whole story in the length of that silence. "What kind of question is that?" Danny said, and his voice had changed, gotten careful. "I'm a consultant, Wade. I work for lots of— One named Danny. Who found you the Marchetti job? Who told you about a Ferrari with 17 dead engineers on it? Because you didn't stumble onto that. Somebody handed it to you. Who?" The silence this time was longer. Rachel Bennett was watching the phone like a hawk watches grass move. Serena had gone pale. "Wade, listen to me," Danny said finally, and all the warmth was gone, now replaced by something that sounded almost like fear. It wasn't supposed to look. You have to understand they came to me. Months ago. A man named Vance. Preston Vance, from Halverson. He knew I used to work with you. He knew we were friends. He offered me a lot of money to keep tabs on you. That's all it was supposed to be. Just tell them where you were, what you were doing, whether you were ever a threat. And I told them the truth. which was that you were fixing minivans in a garage and you were never coming back, and they paid me, and I hated myself. But it was money, Wade. I was drowning. And the Ferrari, Wade said. His voice was terribly quiet. They set it up, Danny whispered. The Marchetti car. Vance knew Aldo Marchetti had one of your prototype valves. Halverson had records they'd tracked every early unit that ever left the building, because they were terrified one would surface. When the car died and Serena started looking for someone to fix it, Vance saw a chance. He didn't want it fixed, Wade. He wanted it to fail. 17 engineers, and every one of them was steered primed to write it off, so that eventually she'd give up and put the car in a vault where nobody would ever open that engine. And I was supposed to make sure that if she ever did find somebody stubborn enough to keep looking, it'd be you. Because you'd fix it and stay quiet. Because you were broken. Because a broken man doesn't blow up his own life to reopen a war he already lost. Danny's voice cracked. That was the whole plan, Wade. You were supposed to fix the car and never say a word. I told them you would. God help me, I told them you would. Wade Coleman looked at Rachel Bennett. Rachel Bennett looked at Wade Coleman. And a slow, dangerous smile spread across the old lawyer's face. Mr. Reyes, Rachel said, leaning toward the phone. My name is Rachel Bennett. I'm an attorney. You've just told us on a recorded line that Preston Vance of Halverson Dynamics paid you to surveil Wade Coleman and to steer a Ferrari containing a Coleman prototype valve toward exactly this outcome. Do you understand what that is? Silence. That's not just a stolen patent anymore, Rachel said, and her voice was almost gentle. That's a coordinated effort to bury evidence and defraud a court. That's conspiracy. And you, Mr. Reyes, are currently standing in the middle of it holding a bag. She let it sit for a moment. But you called Wade this morning, and you sounded to my ear like a man who's been sick about this for 6 years. So here's what I'm going to offer you. You can be the man who helped Halverson bury an innocent engineer twice. Or you can be the witness who helped bring them down. Those are the only 2 doors in the room now, Mr. Reyes, and they're closing. The line was quiet for so long, Wade thought Danny had hung up. Then small and broken Danny said, What do you need me to do? Wade closed his eyes and let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding for 6 years. Right now, nothing, Rachel said briskly. You go about your day exactly as normal. You don't tell Vance anything's changed. You don't tell him the car got fixed. You don't tell him the valve came out. You don't tell him a lawyer's involved. As far as Preston Vance knows, everything is going according to his plan, and Wade Coleman is fixing a Ferrari and keeping his mouth shut like a good broken man. You keep it that way. Can you do that? Yeah, Danny said. Yeah, I can do that. Wade. His voice broke again. Wade, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I stood there 6 years ago, and I let them do it to you, and I've been paying for it every single day, and I was too much of a coward to... Danny. Wade cut him off, not unkindly. You can spend the rest of your life being sorry, or you can help me fix it. You told me 2 days ago you wanted to make it right. So make it right, that's all. Just make it right. He hung up. For a moment, nobody said anything. Serena Marchetti had a hand pressed over her mouth. When she took it away, her eyes were blazing. They killed my father's car on purpose, she said very quietly, and the steel in her voice had gone molten. They steered 17 men to lie to my face and let me believe he was gone twice so that a man named Preston Vance could protect a patent he stole. They used my grief. They used my father's masterpiece as a lid to keep a coffin shut. She turned to Rachel Bennett, and Wade saw in her face the exact expression Aldo Marchetti must have worn when he talked about takers. How do we destroy them? We don't destroy anyone, Rachel said. We do something much worse to men like this. We tell the truth in a room they can't buy, and we make it airtight, and we make it public, and we let it do the destroying for us. She snapped her laptop shut. But we do it in order. The valve first. Neutral third party sealed and documented today. Then I spend a week with that hard drive and a forensic tech I trust with my life. Then, and only then, we decide how and when Preston Vance finds out his broken man learned how to fight. She looked at Wade. And in the meantime, you do the one thing he'd never in a million years expect. What's that? Rachel Bennett smiled. You fix the car. Wade blinked. You just said, I said the valve comes out and gets sealed by a neutral party first. It will. And then a new one machined by you on camera. So there's no question the original evidence was preserved. Untouched goes back in the engine, and you fix Aldo Marchetti's Ferrari, and you make it run, because Serena Marchetti has an international showcase in 3 weeks where the entire automotive world is going to be watching. And there is no stage on this earth better for the truth to come out on than that one. Rachel's eyes were bright and hard. Preston Vance thinks he's steering a broken man toward a quiet grave. Let's let him keep thinking it. Let's let him relax. And then let's put that Ferrari on the biggest stage in the world running perfectly. And let's introduce the man who fixed it. And let's tell 3,000 people and every camera in the industry exactly what's inside that engine and exactly whose initials are scratched on it. She spread her hands. You want to know how you beat a man who does everything in the dark, Mr. Coleman? You drag him into the brightest light there is. Wade Coleman looked at the two women in his garage. The billionaire whose grief had been weaponized against her, the old lawyer who didn't do feelings and had just declared war on his behalf, and he felt the last of the fear that had lived in his chest for 6 years turn into something else. Not hope this time. Hope was too soft a word. This was harder than hope. This was purpose. Then let's get to work, he said. The neutral third party turned out to be a metallurgist from a university lab that Rachel trusted, a nervous, precise young man named Dr. Osei, who arrived that afternoon and spent 2 hours photographing, weighing, measuring, and finally sealing the original valve in a tamper-evident evidence pouch while the camera recorded every second, and Rachel narrated the chain of custody in a flat courtroom voice. When it was done, the sealed pouch went into a case, and the case went into Rachel's canvas bag, and Rachel looked at Wade and said, This never leaves my sight until it's in front of a judge. You understand, this little valve is your whole life. I'm going to guard it like it's my own child. And then with the original safely sealed, Wade Coleman finally got to do the thing he'd come alive to do. He machined the duplicate that night on his father's lathe with Grace asleep in the house and Serena watching from the stool and the camera running. It took him 4 hours, and Serena watched every minute of it, watched his hands move with a certainty that had nothing arrogant left in it anymore, watched a man do the one thing in the world he'd been born to do. When the new valve came off the lathe, Wade held it up next to a photograph of the original, and they were identical down to 1/1000th of an inch, except that on the new one on the side where the casting met the bore, Wade had scratched nothing at all. Aren't you going to sign it? Serena asked. Your initials, like the old one. Wade looked at the little valve in his palm. No, he said quietly. The old one I signed because I was a kid who wanted the world to know how smart I was. This one I don't need to sign. He set it down carefully. The world's about to know exactly how smart I was. I don't have to scratch it into steel anymore. He installed it the next morning. It took him 20 minutes to set the valve, another hour to close everything he'd opened, to torque every bolt, to spec, to trace every line. And the whole time, Grace stood on the stool beside him, the way she always did, handing him tools, watching his hands. And Serena stood back and watched the two of them and pressed her lips together against something rising in her throat. All right, Wade said finally, standing back and wiping his hands. That's it. That's everything. He looked at Serena. You want to do the honors? It's your father's car. Serena Marchetti climbed into the driver's seat of the Ferrari for the first time in 8 months. Her hands were shaking on the wheel. She looked out through the windshield at Wade Coleman standing in front of the car with his daughter beside him and at the beautiful red hood between them. And she thought about her father, greased to his elbows, telling a little girl that a machine remembers the hands that built it. What if it doesn't start? She said. Her voice was very small. What if you're wrong? What if it's really gone? then it's gone, and it was never your fault, and it was never his fault, and you'll have known that 17 men and one mechanic all did everything they could." Wade said it gently. "But I'm not wrong. I heard it, Serena. It was never gone. It was just waiting for somebody to listen. Turn the key." Serena Marchetti closed her eyes. She turned the key. The starter cranked. The engine spun, that same horrible sound of a machine, trying and failing once, twice, and Wade's heart stopped. Because 8 months of dead silence had trained everyone in that garage to expect nothing. And for one endless second, there was nothing. And Grace's small hand found her father's and gripped it hard. And then the Ferrari roared. It didn't cough. It didn't stumble. It caught all at once and roared to life with a sound like something enormous and beautiful waking up from a long sleep. A deep, throaty, glorious sound that filled the little garage and rattled the tools on the pegboard and rolled out through the open door into the gray Michigan morning. And it did not stop. It settled instantly into a smooth, even idle, the idle of an engine that was not just alive but happy purring, like it had never been dead at all, like it had only ever been waiting. Serena Marchetti sat in her dead father's car, with her hands frozen on the wheel and the engine singing around her, and she began to cry. Not the silent tears from the floor 2 days before, but great gasping, helpless sobs, her whole body shaking. 8 months of grief and 8 years of missing her father, and a lifetime of watching takers win, all breaking loose at once. And through the windshield, she saw Wade Coleman standing there with his daughter's hand in his, and he was not smiling exactly. He had his eyes closed and his face turned up slightly, listening to the engine, the way he'd listened to it dead. And there were tears on his face, too, running down into the stubble. And Grace was looking up at her father, with her mouth open in wonder. "You hear that, Gracie?" Wade said, his eyes still closed, his voice thick. "You hear that?" "It's so loud," Grace whispered. "Yeah." Wade opened his eyes. But it wasn't the loud thing that was ever the answer, remember. It was the quiet thing, one little part smaller than my fist, that everybody was too busy to hear. He looked at the roaring, glorious car, and then down at his daughter. The whole world drove right past it, baby. 17 of the smartest men alive, and it was there the whole time, just waiting for somebody to get quiet enough to hear the truth. Serena finally killed the engine and climbed out of the car on unsteady legs, and she crossed the garage and did something that startled all three of them. She threw her arms around Wade Coleman and held onto him like a drowning woman. And Wade, after a frozen second, put one arm around her shoulders, and over her head, he met Grace's eyes, and Grace was grinning like the sun coming up. "Thank you," Serena said into his shoulder over and over. "Thank you, thank you, thank you." "You're welcome," Wade said quietly. She pulled back and wiped her face and laughed, embarrassed, remaking herself into the composed woman who'd stepped out of the Mercedes 2 days before, except that woman was gone now, and they all knew it. "That's the first time I've heard that engine since he died," she said. "It sounds exactly the same, exactly, like he's—" She pressed her lips together. "Like he's still in there, somewhere." "A machine remembers the hands that built it," Wade said. Serena looked at him sharply. "How did you— You told me, 2 days ago." Wade almost smiled. "I listen. It's the only thing I've ever been any good at." Rachel Bennett, who had been standing quietly by the workbench, watching the whole thing, with an expression that was for a woman who did not do feeling suspiciously bright around the eyes, cleared her throat. "That was very beautiful," she said, "and I mean that sincerely, and I hate to be the one to bring the room back down to earth. But that car running is not the end of anything. It's the starting gun." She lifted her canvas bag, the one with the sealed valve and the hard drive inside. "In 3 weeks, that Ferrari goes on a stage in front of the entire automotive world. And somewhere across town right now is a man named Preston Vance, who thinks he's already won, who thinks the broken engineer fixed the car and crawled back into his hole exactly like he planned." She looked at Wade Coleman, and the fight in her eyes was a live thing now. He has no idea what's coming. He has no idea that the man he buried spent 6 years building a case in a toolbox that his own paid informant just confessed on a recorded line that his stolen patent has your fingerprints scratched into steel and sealed in my bag. He thinks the story's over. She shouldered the bag. We're going to let him keep thinking that, right up until the moment we introduce the whole world to the man who fixed the car that couldn't be fixed. Wade Coleman stood in his garage, one arm still around a billionaire, his daughter's hand in his, a dead man's masterpiece, idling warm and alive behind him. And for the first time in 6 years, he was not afraid of what came next. He was ready for it. They had 11 days of quiet before Preston Vance found out, and Rachel Bennett had been right about everything except the timing. It came sooner than even she expected. She'd spent those 11 days the way a surgeon spends the hours before an operation, methodical, unhurried on the surface, and absolutely relentless underneath. She'd brought in her forensic technician, a soft-spoken man named Curtis, who set up in Wade's spare bedroom with 3 monitors, and did not emerge for 4 days except to eat. She'd taken the sealed valve to Dr. Osie's lab for a full metallurgical dating analysis. She'd pulled the public patent filing and laid it page by page next to the dated design journals from Wade's toolbox, and she'd sat at Wade's wobbly kitchen table with the 2 documents side by side and gone very quiet for a long time. "Wade," she'd said finally, "come look at this." He'd come and looked. She was pointing at a diagram in the Halverson patent, a cross-section of the valve seat, the critical internal geometry, and then at the same diagram in his own notebook dated 2 years earlier. "They didn't just steal your design," Rachel said. "Look at the annotations, right here. There's a design flaw in this early version. You can see it. You caught it yourself. There's a note in your own handwriting 3 pages later where you fixed it." She turned pages in his notebook. "See, you revised it. You improved the seat angle. But the patent," she tapped the Halverson document, "the patent has the flaw, the uncorrected version. They filed the version you'd already thrown away." Wade stared at it. "They didn't have the finished design," he said slowly. "They only had what they could copy off the prototype hardware that was already out in the field. Off units, like the one in Aldo's car. They never had my final notebooks. Those were in my head and in my personal journals, the ones I took home." He looked up at Rachel. "Which means the version in their patent physically cannot have come from any final design document, because no final design document with that flaw ever existed. The only place that exact flawed geometry exists is on the early prototype hardware, and on my dated notebook page where I drew it before I fixed it, which predates their filing by 2 years. Rachel said softly, "and which they can't explain having because the only way to get it is to have copied a prototype they've spent 6 years pretending never existed." She closed both documents. "Wade, do you understand what you have here? This isn't a he said, she said about who thought of what. This is a fingerprint. They photocopied a rough draft and called it their invention, and the draft has an error in it that proves it was copied from your hardware and not developed independently. A first-year law student could win this. I'm going to enjoy it." And so, it might have gone exactly to Rachel's careful plan. The quiet build-up, the airtight case, the showcase reveal 3 weeks out if Serena Marchetti had been able to keep a Ferrari's resurrection entirely to herself. But she couldn't, and it wasn't her fault. She'd told no one about the valve, no one about Wade's past, no one about the case. But she had to explain to her own board why the car her father built, the car she'd publicly written off as unrecoverable, the car 17 engineers had condemned, was suddenly back on the showcase roster. She'd said only that she'd found a specialist who succeeded where others failed. That was all. It was true. It should have been safe. It wasn't. Because one of the men on Serena Marchetti's board played golf twice a month with a man from Halverson Dynamics and mentioned idly over the 9th hole that the CEO had gotten her impossible Ferrari running after all some mechanic outside Detroit apparently worked a miracle. By that evening, Preston Vance knew. And by the next morning, everything changed. Wade was under a customer's Camry when Serena's Mercedes came flying up the drive too fast and stopped too hard, and Serena got out with her phone in her hand and her face the color of ash. "They know," she said. "Wade, they know." He slid out from under the car. "Slow down. Who knows what?" "Vance, Halverson. They know you fixed the car. One of my board members told a Halverson man over golf, and it got to Vance, and—" She held up her phone, hand trembling. "I have a lawyer on my board, my own general counsel, who just got a call from Halverson's legal department. They're filing an injunction, this afternoon, to stop the Ferrari from appearing at the showcase." Wade got to his feet slowly, wiping his hands. "On what grounds it's your car?" "On the grounds that the car contains proprietary Halverson technology," Serena said, reading from her phone, her voice climbing, "and that displaying it publicly would constitute unauthorized commercial use of a patented Halverson component, and that the—" She looked up, and her eyes were wide with fury and fear. "The mechanic who serviced it. One Wade Coleman is a former Halverson employee bound by a confidentiality and non-compete agreement, and that any work he performed on Halverson technology is a breach of contract, and they are seeking damages and an injunction against both of us, and—" Her voice cracked. "And they named Grace Wade. In the filing, they referenced your personal circumstances and your dependent minor in a paragraph about how the financial damages could be structured. They put your daughter in a legal threat." Wade Coleman went very still. For a moment, the garage was silent, except for the tick of the Camry's cooling engine, and something moved across Wade's face that Serena had not seen before, not in 2 weeks of watching this gentle, careful man. The gentleness didn't leave, it just got a spine. "Call Rachel," he said quietly. "Now." Rachel Bennett arrived 40 minutes later, and she did not look afraid. She looked, if anything, delighted in the grim way of a fighter who's just felt the other guy commit to a punch that's going to leave him wide open. "Good," she said, reading the injunction filing off Serena's phone. "Good, good, good. This is very good." "How is any of this good?" Serena demanded. "They're going to stop the showcase. They put his child in a legal document." "They put his child in a legal document," Rachel said, setting the phone down, "because Preston Vance is scared, and scared men overreach, and an overreaching man hands you the rope. Listen to me, both of you, and listen carefully, because the next 72 hours decide everything." She pulled a chair from Wade's kitchen table and sat, and Wade and Serena sat across from her, and Grace, who had come to the doorway at the sound of raised voices, was waved in by her father, and came to stand at his side, and Rachel, glancing at the girl, did not send her away. First, the confidentiality agreement. "Wade, do you remember signing a non-compete when they fired you?" "I signed a stack of paper the day they walked me out. I didn't read it. He shook his head. "I wasn't in any state to read it." "I've already read it," Rachel said. "Serena's counsel sent me a copy an hour ago. And here's the thing about that agreement, Wade. It's built to protect Halverson's proprietary information, which means to enforce it, they have to first assert that the technology in question is legitimately theirs. They can't come into court and say, 'That man violated our rights regarding the Halverson thermal governor,' without first standing behind the claim that the Halverson thermal governor is genuinely lawfully their invention." She smiled, slow and dangerous. "They just built their entire attack on a foundation we can prove is a lie. The moment they assert ownership of that technology in a courtroom under oath in a filing, they've walked into the one room where I get to open that toolbox. They're not stopping the showcase, Wade. They just turned a marketing event into a courtroom, and they did it themselves, and they did it in a hurry, and they did it angry. That's not a threat. That's a gift. And Grace," Wade said, and his voice was low, "they named my daughter." Rachel's face changed. The delight went out of it, replaced by something colder and more personal. "Yes," she said. "They did. And when this is over, Wade, that paragraph, the one where a corporation's lawyers reached into a child's life to squeeze her father. That paragraph is going to be read aloud in a courtroom, and then it's going to be read aloud by every journalist covering this story. And it is going to do more damage to Halverson Dynamics than any patent claim ever could. Because juries and readers forgive a lot, but they do not forgive a giant threatening a 9-year-old. Preston Vance just wrote the headline that ends his career, and he doesn't even know it yet." She looked at Grace, and her voice softened. Nobody's taking anything from you, sweetheart. I promise you that. Your dad's got the best lawyer in the state, and your dad's got the truth, and between those two things, the people who wrote that mean paper are going to be very, very sorry. Grace looked up at her father. Are they trying to do the thing again? The thing from before? Yeah, baby, Wade said. They're trying to do the thing again. But it won't work this time, Grace said. It wasn't a question quite. It was a 9-year-old checking the load-bearing beam of her whole world. Wade knelt down and looked her in the eye. You remember what I told you, he said. 2 weeks ago on the driveway. You remember what I promised you. You said you'd get our name back, Grace whispered. The real one, the good one. And do I break my promises to you? No. No, Wade said. I don't, not ever. So you hold on to that. It might get loud, Gracie. It might get real loud these next few days. But you and me, we already know the loud thing was never the answer. So we're gonna stay quiet, and we're gonna stay steady, and we're gonna let the truth do what the truth does. Okay. Grace threw her arms around his neck, and Wade held her, and over her shoulder, he looked at Rachel Bennett, and the look on his face was not the look of a broken man anymore. It was the look of a man with something to fight for, and at last, the weapons to fight with. Tell me what you need me to do, he said. What Rachel needed was for the injunction hearing to happen fast, and Halverson in their arrogance had already made that possible by filing on an emergency basis. They wanted the Ferrari stopped before the showcase, which meant they needed a ruling within 2 weeks, which meant a hearing within days. Rachel filed her response the next morning, and she did something that made Serena's general counsel physically wince when he read it. She didn't just contest the injunction. She counterclaimed. She asserted in a public filing that Wade Coleman was the original and true inventor of the technology Halverson had patented, that Halverson had obtained the patent through fraud, that Wade's termination 6 years earlier had been engineered to remove him as an obstacle, and that Halverson had in the preceding months conspired to surveil Wade Coleman and to manipulate the Marchetti restoration for the purpose of suppressing evidence of that fraud. You just told them everything we have, Serena said, staring at the filing. You showed them our whole hand. I showed them enough of our hand to make them panic, Rachel corrected. Not the valve, not Danny's confession, not the metallurgical dating, not the flaw in their own patent that proves they copied prototype hardware. Those are the cards I keep. But I told them the shape of the fight, Serena, on purpose, because I want Preston Vance to spend the next 4 days terrified. I want him making phone calls. I want him doing something stupid. Scared men in a hurry make mistakes, and every mistake he makes between now and the hearing is another exhibit for me. She looked up. And there's one more reason. The moment that counterclaim was filed, this stopped being a private dispute Halverson could bury with a settlement and a non-disclosure. It's public record now. A journalist is going to find it. Probably already has. And once the press has the shape of the story forgotten engineer stolen patent billionaire's Ferrari, a company that framed him, Preston Vance loses the one weapon that ever worked for him. The dark. He can't fight this in the dark anymore. I just turned the lights on. She was right about the journalist. 2 days before the hearing, a reporter named Delia Okafor from one of the big automotive trade publications called Rachel's office, and then called Serena's, and then having gotten nowhere with either, did what good reporters do, and found Wade Coleman's garage on her own. She showed up on a Tuesday afternoon, and Wade, who had been warned by Rachel to say absolutely nothing to the press, opened his door to find a sharp-eyed woman with a recorder already in her hand. Mr. Coleman, she said. Delia Okafor, I've read the filing. I've read the Halverson patent. I've read your old personnel records, the ones from when you were fired. And I've got a story that doesn't add up, and I think you're the only person who can make it add up, and I think you've been waiting 6 years for somebody to ask. She looked at him steadily. So I'm asking, what really happened to you at Halverson Dynamics? Wade stood in his doorway and thought about Rachel's instruction to say nothing. And then he thought about 6 years of saying nothing. I can't talk about the case, he said. My lawyer would have my head. But you should come in out of the cold, Ms. Okafor, and you should meet somebody. He brought her into the garage, and there, under the work lights, sat Aldo Marchetti's Ferrari, red as wine, gleaming alive. Delia Okafor stopped in the doorway and looked at it, and Wade watched a hardened reporter go briefly helplessly soft the way everyone did when they saw that car. 17 engineers said this couldn't be fixed, Wade said quietly. The best in the world. I'm not going to tell you anything about the case, but I'll tell you this because it's just true, and anybody can verify it. That car runs, right now. And it runs because of one small part, a part I designed a long time ago, before a company decided my name was worth less than the thing I'd built. He looked at her. You want the story that doesn't add up? Turn the key yourself. Listen to it. And then ask yourself why a man who could build the thing that makes that engine sing is fixing minivans in a garage outside Detroit while another man's name is on the patent. He stepped back. That's all I've got. The rest my lawyer will tell you when the time's right. But you wanted to know what really happened to me. He nodded at the car. That did. That's what happened to me. I built something beautiful, and somebody else took the credit, and it cost me everything. And it's been sitting in engines all over the world for 6 years, running perfectly, keeping its mouth shut, just like they wanted me to. Delia Okafor looked at the Ferrari for a long moment. Then she turned off her recorder. Off the record, she said. Just between us. Are you going to win? Wade Coleman looked at the car his hands had brought back to life, and he thought about the valve sealed in Rachel Bennett's bag, and Danny's confession on the recorded line, and the flaw in Halverson's own patent that proved the theft, and his daughter asleep in the house who'd made him promise. And for the first time, he let himself say it out loud to another human being. Yeah, he said. I think I am. The story ran the morning of the hearing. Delia Okafor had honored her word and printed nothing about the case itself. No valve, no confession, no legal strategy. She'd printed something more dangerous. She'd printed the human story. A profile. A forgotten engineer in a Detroit garage. A single father. A man who'd built something the whole industry used every day, fixing other people's cars for $100 and letting them pay half now and half later. She'd printed a photograph of Wade standing next to the resurrected Ferrari with grease on his hands and his daughter half hidden behind his leg. She'd printed the fact, verifiable and unglamorous, that 17 of the world's best engineers had failed to fix a car that a broke mechanic outside Detroit had brought back to life. And she'd ended with a single question aimed at no one and everyone. How does a man like this end up here? By the time Wade Coleman walked into the courthouse that afternoon in the one suit he owned, the story had been shared 100,000 times. And Preston Vance, it turned out, could not help himself. Because Rachel had been right about scared men and mistakes, and the biggest mistake was already made. Halverson's own emergency injunction had put Preston Vance in that courtroom in person, because he'd insisted on being there, because he could not stand the thought of the broken man he'd buried getting so much as a hearing without Vance there to watch it fail. He sat at the Halverson table in a suit that cost more than Wade's truck, flanked by 4 lawyers, and when Wade walked in, Vance looked at him with an expression of such casual, comfortable contempt that Serena, sitting in the gallery, felt her hands curl into fists. He thought he'd already won. 6 years of winning had taught him he always did. The hearing was supposed to be narrow, just the question of whether to grant the injunction stopping the Ferrari's appearance. But Rachel Bennett had never intended to keep it narrow. She let Halverson's lead attorney make his case. First, let him stand up and assert cleanly and confidently, and on the record, that the technology in the Marchetti Ferrari was the proprietary intellectual property of Halverson Dynamics, patented and protected, and that Wade Coleman had no right to touch it. She let him say it. She let him say it 3 different ways, pinning him to it, making the record unambiguous. And then Rachel Bennett stood up. Your Honor, she said, opposing counsel has just asserted repeatedly and unambiguously that the technology in question is the lawful invention and property of Halverson Dynamics. I'd like to test that assertion, because the entire basis for this injunction, every claim of breach, every demand for damages, the reference opposing counsel saw fit to make to my client's 9-year-old daughter, all of it rests on the premise that Halverson owns this technology. She walked to her table and lifted her canvas bag. "I have here a small component. It was removed 2 weeks ago from the engine of the 1962 Ferrari, restored privately over 20 years by the late Aldo Marchetti. A restoration documented by receipts, photographs, and insurance appraisals. I've entered into the record." The removal was performed on camera, witnessed and sealed by an independent metallurgist from the State University, whose analysis dates the component's manufacture to a period predating Halverson's patent filing by no less than 4 years. She held up the evidence pouch and scratched into the side of this component. "Your Honor, are the initials WC. My client had a documented habit noted twice in his Halverson personnel file, which I've also entered into the record of marking his prototype hardware in exactly this way. A habit his supervisors repeatedly told him to stop." The Halverson table had gone very still. "But that's not even the strongest evidence, Your Honor," Rachel continued, and now her voice had the quiet, terrible momentum of an avalanche that's already started. "Because a signature can be disputed. So let me show the court something that cannot." She laid 2 enlarged documents on the easel. On the left, the cross-sectional diagram from Halverson's own patent filing. On the right, a page from my client's personal design journal dated 2 years before that filing. They are, as the court can see, identical, except for one thing. My client's journal contains a design flaw in the valve seat geometry, an error which he identified and corrected 3 pages later, also dated. The corrected version is superior. It is the version any competent engineer would build. And yet Halverson's patent, she tapped the left-hand document, contains the flaw, the uncorrected error, the version my client threw away. She turned to face the Halverson table. There is only one way for Halverson Dynamics to have obtained a design containing an error that existed only in a discarded early draft and in the physical prototype hardware built from it. They copied the hardware. They never had the finished design because the finished design lived in my client's private journals, the ones they didn't think to confiscate from a man they assumed was too broken to ever fight back. They patented a rough draft, Your Honor. And a rough draft cannot be independently invented because by definition it is a copy of something that came before. The silence in the courtroom was total. Preston Vance had stopped looking contemptuous. He was leaning forward, and he was whispering furiously to his lead attorney. And the lead attorney was not whispering back, because the lead attorney was a competent man who had just watched the foundation of his entire case turn to sand, and who understood, as Vance did not yet fully understand, that the injunction was the least of their problems now. "Your Honor," Rachel said, "opposing counsel came before this court to stop a car from being shown at an auto show. In doing so, they were required to assert ownership of technology that I can now demonstrate through physical evidence, forensic dating documentary comparison, and the sworn testimony of witnesses was invented by my client and taken from him through fraud. I would respectfully suggest that this hearing has become about something considerably larger than an injunction. And I have one more witness whose testimony bears directly on how exactly this Ferrari came to be steered toward my client's garage in the first place, a man named Daniel Reyes, currently under retainer to Halverson Dynamics, who I believe opposing counsel will not want to see take the stand." At the Halverson table, Preston Vance's face had gone from red to a sick, bloodless white, and Wade Coleman, sitting quietly beside his lawyer in the one suit he owned, watched the man who had taken everything from him finally understand that the broken thing he'd buried 6 years ago had spent all that time in the dark, patiently, quietly becoming exactly the weapon that would bury him. Wade didn't smile. He'd waited 6 years, and now that it was here, it didn't feel like triumph. It felt like the moment an engine that everyone swore was dead finally at long last caught and roared. The judge did not grant the injunction. She did something far worse for Halverson Dynamics. She denied it from the bench in under a minute, and then looking over her glasses at the 4 lawyers at the Halverson table, she said that in 30 years, she had rarely seen a party come before her seeking to stop something and instead succeed only in exposing themselves, and that she was referring certain matters raised in the counterclaim, specifically the allegations of fraud and the sworn confession Ms. Bennett had proffered to be heard on their merits on an expedited basis. and that she strongly suggested Halverson Dynamics retain different counsel for what was coming, because the counsel they had were about to be witnesses. Preston Vance walked out of that courtroom, a dead man walking, and he knew it, and the only person who didn't seem to know it was Vance himself, right up until the moment he made his final mistake. He caught Wade in the hallway outside. His lawyers were trying to steer him toward the elevators, but he shook them off and crossed the marble floor to where Wade stood, with Grace's hand in his. Grace had insisted on coming, had sat in the gallery next to Serena in her best dress, had watched the whole thing with her father's own careful, watchful eyes, and Preston Vance stopped a foot away from a man he'd spent 6 years trying to erase, and hissed low so the reporters drifting toward them wouldn't hear. "You think you've won something? You think this changes anything? I have more money than you'll ever see, Coleman. I'll bury you in appeals for the next decade. Mr. Vance?" Wade's voice was quiet, level. He didn't step back. He didn't raise it. "There's a 9-year-old holding my hand. Choose your next words like she's your own." Vance looked down. He saw Grace. He saw her looking up at him, not afraid, just studying him the way her father studied a machine, trying to hear the small, quiet thing under the loud thing, and whatever Preston Vance saw in that child's steady gaze seemed to unmoor him completely, because his mouth worked and nothing came out. And in that silence, Delia Okafor's recorder held discreetly at her side caught every word that had already been said. "You put her in a legal document," Wade said, still quiet. "That paragraph about my dependent minor. You reached into my little girl's life to try to squeeze me. I've thought a lot about what I'd say to you if I ever got the chance. 6 years of thinking about it." He shook his head slowly. "And now you're standing here and I don't have a speech. I just feel sorry for you. Because you had everything, Vance. You had money and a title and a patent that made you rich, and you spent it all, every bit of it, being terrified of one broke mechanic in a garage. You could have just let me go. I was gone. I was fixing minivans. I'd made my peace with it. But you couldn't stand it, could you? You had to make sure I stayed buried. And that's the thing you never understood." Wade's eyes didn't waver. "A man who's already lost everything has nothing left for you to threaten. You didn't wake me up, Vance. Your own fear did. You dug me up because you couldn't stand the thought of me sleeping." Preston Vance had no answer. There wasn't one. He turned and walked to the elevators with his career collapsing behind him, one step at a time, and he never once looked back. And the last thing Wade Coleman ever saw of the man who'd taken his life was the back of an expensive suit disappearing between 2 closing doors. Grace tugged his hand. "Dad, was that him?" "The loud thing?" Wade looked down at her. "Yeah, baby, that was the loud thing." "He wasn't even that scary." "No," Wade said, and something in his chest that had been clenched for 6 years finally fully let go. "No, he wasn't. They never are once you finally get quiet enough to really hear them." The legal war that followed took the better part of a year, but it was never truly in doubt after that afternoon in the hallway. Danny Reyes testified, and his confession, the surveillance. The payments, the deliberate steering of the Marchetti restoration toward a man Halverson believed was too broken to fight, turned an intellectual property dispute into something with the smell of criminal conspiracy on it. The forged emails from 6 years ago, the ones Wade had kept in his father's toolbox, with no idea whether they'd ever matter, went to Curtis the forensic technician, and Curtis pulled the metadata apart, layer by layer, and demonstrated to a certainty no jury could ignore that every one of the approvals bearing Wade Coleman's signature had been created weeks after the failures they supposedly authorized by a workstation that had never been assigned to Wade, backdated by a hand that wanted an innocent man to hang. The patent was invalidated. Halverson Dynamics settled rather than face a jury on the fraud claims, and the settlement was enormous and sealed, but the terms leaked the way such things do, and the number that circulated in the industry press made people who'd never heard of Wade Coleman suddenly very interested in his name. Preston Vance was gone from Halverson within a month quietly, with the kind of exit that fools no one. The chairman Whitfield, the man Rachel had warned, did not lose, held a press conference to announce sweeping changes and a commitment to integrity, and did not once say the name Wade Coleman, and everyone understood exactly why. But none of that. Not the money, not the invalidated patent, not the ruin of the man who'd ruined him. None of that was the thing Wade would remember when he was old. The thing he'd remember was the showcase. They held it anyway. Serena Marchetti had fought a corporation to a standstill to make sure her father's car would appear. And appear it did 3 weeks after the hearing, in a vast hall filled with 3,000 people, and every camera in the automotive world. There were cars there worth more than small nations. There were legends of the industry walking the floor. And when the lights came up on the center stage, there sat Aldo Marchetti's 1962 Ferrari, red as wine, the last thing a great man ever built with his own hands, gleaming under the lights alive. Serena walked out onto that stage in front of 3,000 people, and she was not the composed billionaire who'd stepped out of the Mercedes into Wade's garage 2 months before. She was something more than that now. She took the microphone, and she looked out at the crowd, and she let the silence stretch until it was almost unbearable. "Most of you know this car," she said. "Or you think you do. You know it's a 1962 Ferrari, one of 9 ever made. You know my father restored it over 20 years. And most of you know that 8 months ago it died in my garage, and that 17 of the finest engineers alive examined it, and that every single one of them told me the same thing." She paused. "It can't be fixed." The hall was silent. "They were wrong," Serena said. "And I want to tell you how I know they were wrong. Not because of a computer, not because of a laboratory, not because of a famous name or an expensive office. This car is alive tonight because of a man who fixes ordinary cars in an ordinary garage outside Detroit. A single father. A man the automotive world threw away 6 years ago, blamed for a failure he didn't cause, robbed of an invention that half the engines in this room depend on." Her voice was steady, and it carried to every corner of the hall. 17 experts looked at my father's car and searched for something dramatic, something worthy of a machine this beautiful. And this man, she gestured to the wings, did something none of them thought to do. He got quiet. He put his hand on the engine, and he closed his eyes, and he listened. And the car told him the truth it had been trying to tell for 8 months. It was never dead. It was never beyond saving. Everyone had simply stopped listening. She turned toward the wings. "My father used to say that a machine remembers the hands that built it," Serena said, and her voice caught just for a moment the way it had the very first time. "And I used to think that was just a beautiful thing an old engineer said. But I've watched this man work. I've watched him touch a machine like it was a living thing that was hurt and afraid. And I don't think it's a beautiful saying anymore. I think it's the truest thing my father ever taught me. So let me introduce him to you, not as a mechanic, not as a former employee of anyone, as the man who saved a piece of history and who taught a billionaire that greatness was never about the size of your office or the fame of your name." She held out her hand. "Wade Coleman." Wade walked out onto the stage. He was wearing his one suit and his hands were clean, but you could still see if you looked close the permanent shadow of a lifetime of grease worked into the creases of his knuckles, the mark of a man who worked with his hands and always would. 3,000 people rose to their feet. The sound of it hit him like a wave, and for a second, Wade Coleman, who had spent 6 years being invisible, nearly turned around and walked back into the wings, because a man can get so used to the dark that the light feels like a mistake. But then he found the 2 faces he was looking for in the front row. Rachel Bennett, who did not do feelings, standing and clapping with tears running unashamed down her face. And beside her, in her best dress, up on her toes, so she could see over the seat in front of her, both hands raised over her head, screaming his name at the top of her 9-year-old lungs. Grace. Wade Coleman walked to the center of the stage, and he took the microphone from Serena, and he waited for the ovation to settle, and then he did the thing he'd come to do. "I'm not much for speeches," he said, and his rough voice filled the enormous hall. "I fix cars. That's what I know how to do, so I'll keep it to what I know." He looked out at the sea of faces. 6 years ago, some people decided my name was worth less than a thing I built, and they took it. my work, my career, and then they made sure the world believed the worst about me so I'd stay down. And I'll be honest with you, I stayed down. For 6 years, I fixed minivans, and I told myself that was all I was ever going to be, and I made my peace with it, because peace is what you make when you've stopped believing in anything better. He paused. And then a woman drove her dead father's car across 4 states to a garage nobody had ever heard of, because 17 brilliant men had already told her there was no hope, and she asked me to listen to it. He looked over at the Ferrari gleaming under the lights. "Here's the only thing I really know, and then I'll get off this stage," Wade said. "The whole world is loud. It's loud with people telling you what can't be done and who you're allowed to be and what your name is worth. And the loud thing is almost never the truth. The truth is quiet. The truth is one small part smaller than your fist buried where nobody thinks to look, telling you what's really wrong patiently for as long as it takes until somebody finally cares enough to get quiet and hear it." His eyes found Grace's again in the front row. "I have a daughter. She's 9. Her name is Grace. And for 6 years I was terrified that the thing I was teaching her by staying down was that the takers win. That you build something beautiful and somebody stronger takes it, and there's nothing you can do but keep your head down and fix minivans." His voice went thick, but it didn't break. "I don't have to worry about that anymore, because she got to watch the truth win. She got to watch her dad get his name back, the real one, the good one, the one I promised her I'd get back. And I want to say to every person out there who's been thrown away, everybody who's been told they're finished, everybody who's keeping their head down right now because it hurts too much to hope." He lifted his chin. "You're not dead. You're just waiting for somebody to listen. And if nobody will, then you get quiet and you listen to yourself because the truth is still in there. It's still ticking. It never stopped. They just told you it was over and you believed them." He looked at the Ferrari one last time. "It's not over. It was never over. Everyone just stopped listening." He set the microphone down, and then he walked to the car, his hands knowing the way to it before his feet did, and he slid into the driver's seat of Aldo Marchetti's masterpiece, and in front of 3,000 people, and every camera in the industry, Wade Coleman turned the key. The Ferrari roared. It caught instantly all at once that deep and glorious sound rolling out across the vast hall and rattling in 3,000 chests, an engine that a dead man built and a forgotten man saved, singing like it had never once been silent, like it had only ever been waiting for the right hands and the right ears to bring it home. The crowd went wild, and through the windshield, Wade found his daughter, and Grace was crying and laughing at the same time, and she mouthed something at him across the roar that he couldn't hear but didn't need to, because he'd taught her the words himself. Not the loud thing. The quiet thing. He'd heard it. At last, the whole world heard it too. In the months that followed, everything changed, and nothing did. Serena Marchetti offered him a position special engineering consultant, an office at the company, a salary with more zeros than Wade had ever imagined attaching to his own name. He thought about it for a long time, and then he told her no. "You're turning it down," Serena said. They were standing in his garage, the same single bay, the same sticking door, the same hand-painted sign. "Wade, it's everything you lost. It's the office, the title, the respect. It's what they took from you. It's what they took from the man I used to be," Wade said. "But I'm not him anymore. That guy scratched his initials into steel because he needed the world to know how smart he was." He shook his head. "I don't need that now. I know what I am. My daughter knows what I am. That's the whole list of people whose opinion I lose sleep over." He looked around the garage at his father's workbench, at his father's lathe, at the tools hung in perfect order. "Besides, somebody's got to fix the cars nobody else will touch. Somebody's got to be the guy who lets you pay half now and half whenever. If I go sit in an office, who does that? Who listens to the ones everybody else gave up on?" Serena looked at him for a long moment, and then she smiled, the real one, the one that had taken her 2 months and a resurrection to find. "My father would have liked you," she said. "He would have liked you very much." She reached into her bag and set something on his workbench. It was a photograph framed. Aldo Marchetti, greased to his elbows, head under the hood of the very Ferrari that now lived again, grinning at whoever held the camera. "I want you to have this, because you gave me back more than a car weighed. You gave me back the sound of him. Every time I start that engine, he's there. And that's because of you." She paused at the garage door. "You know what you are. You're proof. You're proof that the thing my father spent his whole life believing was actually true. That greatness doesn't live in the big offices. It lives in the hands of the people who never stop caring wherever they happen to be standing." She looked at the little garage, at the whole modest kingdom of it. "The world needs people like you exactly where you are. Don't you dare leave." She got in her Mercedes and drove away, and Wade Coleman stood in his garage and looked at the photograph of a dead man he'd never met and somehow come to know. And then he set it carefully on the shelf above his father's bench, where he'd see it every day. Grace came out from the house done with her homework and climbed up onto the stool beside him, the way she always had, the way she probably always would. "Was that Serena?" she asked. "Did you take the fancy job?" "Nope." Grace considered this with the gravity she gave to all important matters. "Good," she said finally. "I like it here." Yeah, here you're just my dad." She picked up a wrench and turned it over in her small hands, learning the weight of it the way he'd taught her. "In an office, you'd have to wear a tie." Wade laughed, and it was a real laugh, the kind that came all the way up from the bottom, the kind he hadn't had in him for 6 years, and now seemed to have an endless supply of. "Can't have that," he said. "Not the tie." "Not the tie," Grace agreed solemnly. He put his arm around her, and the two of them sat there in the quiet garage, as the light went gold and then gray outside the sticking door. And somewhere in the city, a settlement was being finalized, and a patent office was correcting its records, and an industry was still talking about the mechanic who fixed the car that couldn't be fixed. But none of that reached the little garage. In the little garage, there was just a man and his daughter, and a workbench his own father had built, and the tools hanging in perfect order, and the long, quiet evening stretching out ahead of them full of ordinary cars that would need fixing and ordinary people who couldn't afford to be turned away. Wade Coleman had lost everything once. He'd been thrown away, buried, told by the whole loud world that he was finished. And he had sat in the dark for 6 years, keeping his mouth shut, letting them believe it exactly like they wanted. But a machine remembers the hands that built it. And a man remembers who he really is, no matter how long they bury him, no matter how loudly they tell him he's dead. The truth doesn't stop being true just because nobody's listening. It just waits, quiet, patient, ticking away in the dark once every single time the engine turns, until the day somebody finally cares enough to lean in close and hear it. They called him a nobody. They called him finished. They said it couldn't be fixed. They were wrong about the car. They were wrong about the man. And in the end, the whole world got quiet and leaned in and finally heard the truth that had been there all along.